Dawn breaks over Edo, but the city does not feel like a place that is waking up so much as one that has never truly fallen asleep. Wooden rooftops stretch in ordered rows, mist clings to the canals, and distant footsteps echo along narrow streets where every sound seems measured, restrained, almost rehearsed. In the residences of the samurai, the first movements of the day are already underway. Armor is checked, swords are inspected, posture is corrected even in solitude. Everything appears controlled, everything appears calm, and yet beneath this surface of discipline lies something far less visible, a constant awareness that life itself is unstable, temporary, and always one mistake away from ending. Before going deeper into this world, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. To understand why samurai are remembered as men who feared nothing, it is necessary to begin in a place where fear was never absent. Fear in this world is not loud. It does not always look like panic or retreat. More often it exists as quiet calculation, as awareness of consequence, as refined sensitivity to the fact that death is never distant. A samurai stepping through a wooden gate in Edo carries more than weapons. He carries expectation, hierarchy, and the invisible pressure of reputation that can collapse faster than any physical structure. What survives in the historical record suggests that samurai society was not built on emotional absence, but on emotional management. Fear exists, but it is reshaped, it is redirected, it is disciplined into forms that no longer resemble ordinary panic. The paradox is already present in the earliest descriptions of these warriors men trained to confront death daily, yet deeply aware of how easily honour, status, and existence itself could be erased. The city around them reflects this same tension. Edo is peaceful in comparison to the centuries that preceded it, yet it is a peace built on the memory of prolonged conflict. The scars of earlier eras are not visible in the streets, but they remain embedded in the culture. Families still preserve stories of battles fought in rain-soaked fields, of castles burning against night skies, of betrayals that reshaped entire provinces, even in the era of relative stability. The psychological architecture of war does not disappear, it simply becomes internal. Scholars still debate how much of the samurai's legendary fearlessness is historical reality, and how much is later idealization. What can be observed with more certainty is that their environment demanded a unique relationship with danger. For much of their formative history, samurai didn't live in conditions where safety was guaranteed for any meaningful length of time. Survival was never assumed. It was negotiated day by day, sometimes moment by moment. In such a world, fear does not vanish, it becomes familiar, it becomes structural, it blends into routine the way smoke blends into air after a fire has burned long enough. The human mind adapts not by eliminating fear, but by changing what fear means. A sudden death is no longer the ultimate anomaly, it is one possible outcome among many, all of them constantly present in thought. Even the architecture of samurai residences reflects this mindset. Spaces are designed not only for living, but for readiness. Exits are considered in advance. Movement is structured. The sword is never far from reach. Yet this readiness is not frantic, it is habitual. It resembles more a form of mental posture than active alertness. To outsiders, this may appear as composure. To those within the system, it is simply normal life. Historical accounts from earlier periods, especially the Kamakura and Sengoku eras, describe a world where this mindset was not symbolic but necessary. Small conflicts could escalate rapidly into regional wars. Alliances shifted without warning. Entire families could lose power in a single season. In such an environment, emotional extremes were not useful. Excessive fear led to hesitation. Hesitation led to defeat. Over time, restraint became more valuable than expression. And yet, even in restraint, fear remains present. It is simply hidden beneath layers of training, ritual, and expectation. The samurai who appears calm before battle is not necessarily without fear. He is someone who has learned to carry it without letting it interfere with action. The distinction is subtle, but essential. One of the most enduring misconceptions about this class of warriors is the idea that they were somehow detached from ordinary human vulnerability. In reality, their vulnerability was constant and highly visible. A misjudged gesture, a failed negotiation, or a broken promise could carry consequences far beyond personal risk. The structure of feudal loyalty meant that individual survival was always tied to collective honor. And honor was fragile in ways that physical strength could not fully protect. As Edo's peace continues, this older psychology does not disappear. It transforms. The battlefield becomes less literal, but the mental framework remains intact. Decisions are still shaped by consequences that feel absolute. Even when violence is no longer immediate, the samurai identity, by this point in history, is already less about constant fighting, and more about the memory of what fighting once demanded. What begins here is not a story of fearless men in the simplistic sense. It is a story of men living so close to instability that fear becomes part of their internal language, rewritten until it no longer behaves like fear at all. The world they inhabit rewards control over reaction, silence over panic, precision over impulse. And in such a world, the absence of visible fear is not the absence of fear itself, but the result of centuries spent learning how to survive with it always present. Long before Edo's ordered streets and controlled silence, the world that shaped the samurai was far less stable, far less predictable, and far more porous to violence. The foundations of this warrior class are not found in a single invention or decree, but in centuries of shifting provincial power, where land, loyalty, and survival were negotiated in an environment that rarely paused long enough for certainty to take root. In those earlier centuries, Japan is not a unified stage of governance but a fragmented landscape of competing families, local governors, and armed retainers whose authority exists only as long as they can enforce it. The early emergence of what would later be called samurai begins in the Heian period, a time often remembered for courtly refinement in Kyoto, poetry, and ritual elegance. Yet that image only holds true at the centre. Far from the imperial capital, in the provinces, a different reality unfolds. Land must be defended, taxation must be enforced. Rival families test boundaries constantly. The imperial court, increasingly distant from practical control, relies on local enforcers who gradually evolve from administrative agents into armed specialists. Over time, these men become less representatives of the court and more representatives of their own power. This transformation is slow enough that it is almost invisible to those living through it. A local official who once travelled with minimal escort begins to rely on armed guards. A minor dispute over irrigation or farmland becomes a matter requiring force. In this environment, martial ability is not an abstract virtue. It is a necessary skill for maintaining order in a world where written authority alone is insufficient. The families that rise into prominence during this period do so not simply through violence, but through the ability to organise it. Clans such as the Minamoto and Taira begin to emerge as major military political forces, though even they are not initially conceived as separate from the imperial system. They are extensions of it, at least in theory. In practice, however, they begin to accumulate independent power, forming networks of loyalty that stretch across regions and are held together by obligation, reward, and shared survival rather than abstract loyalty to the court. It is within this environment that the psychological foundations of the samurai begin to take shape. Fear, in such a context, is not something that can be avoided. It is woven into every decision. A failed negotiation may lead to armed retaliation. A weak defence may invite invasion. A betrayal within one's own household is not a distant possibility, but a recurring reality recorded in historical chronicles of the time. The result is a culture where awareness of danger becomes continuous, not episodic. At the same time, external influences begin to shape how this emerging warrior class interprets its own role. China, through earlier centuries of cultural transmission, provides administrative models, philosophical systems, and ethical frameworks that are absorbed and adapted in Japan. Confucian ideas about hierarchy and duty begin to filter into the structure of loyalty. Buddhist thought, already established in Japanese society, introduces concepts of impermanence and detachment that subtly alter how life and death are understood. Yet none of these influences arrive as fully formed systems. They are absorbed selectively, reshaped by the realities of provincial conflict. A philosophy that in its original context may have been concerned with governance or spiritual liberation becomes, in the hands of warriors, a set of tools for managing the psychological weight of constant instability. What is often later called the warrior spirit does not begin as a codified doctrine. It begins as habit, a repeated response to repeated conditions. When violence is frequent enough, hesitation becomes costly. When loyalty is tested often enough, emotional attachment becomes structured rather than spontaneous. Over time, patterns emerge. These patterns are later given names, justified through philosophy, and refined into ethical expectations. But their origin lies in necessity rather than ideology. By the late Heian period, the distinction between court aristocrats and provincial warriors becomes increasingly pronounced. The court continues to emphasize refinement, ritual, and aesthetic culture, while the provinces develop a more pragmatic ethos centered on survival and control. This divergence is not immediately framed as cultural opposition, but it gradually creates two different ways of understanding authority. One is symbolic and ceremonial, the other is practical and enforced. As the Minamoto and Taira clans rise to prominence, the conflicts begin to reshape the political landscape. The Genpei War, culminating in the establishment of the Kamakura shogunate, is often described as a turning point, but its deeper significance lies in what it reveals about the psychological state of the warrior class. Warfare at this scale is not occasional, it is sustained. Battles are not isolated events but part of extended campaigns that stretch across years, involving shifting alliances and repeated cycles of destruction and reconstruction. In such conditions, emotional survival requires adaptation. The human mind cannot remain in a constant state of acute panic without breaking. Instead, it adjusts. Violence becomes routine. Death becomes statistically expected. Individual outcomes matter intensely in the moment, but collectively they form part of a broader continuum of instability. It is within this continuum that the early samurai identity solidifies. The Kamakura shogunate marks the first major institutionalization of warrior rule. Power is no longer merely exercised by military families, it is formally recognized as the governing structure of the state. This shift is not only political, but psychological. It legitimizes a worldview in which martial capability is not secondary to governance but central to it. The samurai are no longer outside the system of authority, they are the system. With this change comes a subtle but profound transformation in how fear is experienced and expressed. When violence is no longer a breakdown of order but a component of it, fear must be managed differently. It cannot be eliminated, because the conditions that produce it remain. Instead, it is incorporated into discipline. Warriors are trained not simply to fight, but to remain functional under the awareness of death. Historical records from this period suggest that expectations of composure begin to formalize. A warrior who hesitates in battle risks not only his own life, but the reputation of his entire household. Reputation, in turn, determines future alliances, land holdings, and survival. The stakes are cumulative, and they extend beyond individual encounters. This creates a feedback loop in which emotional restraint becomes increasingly valuable, not because fear disappears, but because its visible expression becomes strategically dangerous. The influence of Buddhism becomes particularly significant in this context. The concept of impermanence, already present in broader Japanese culture, takes on a more immediate and practical meaning for warriors. Life is not merely transient in an abstract philosophical sense, it is transient in a literal operational sense. It can end suddenly, without warning, and often without personal control. This understanding does not eliminate fear, but it reframes it. What is feared is not death itself, but failure to act appropriately in the face of it. Zen practices, which emphasize direct experience and mental clarity, begin to intersect with martial discipline. Meditation is not separated from warfare, but increasingly associated with it as a method of stabilizing attention. The goal is not emotional emptiness, but clarity under pressure. A mind that cannot be easily disrupted becomes a practical advantage in environments where hesitation can be fatal. As these ideas circulate among warrior families, they begin to form the early foundations of what will later be systematized as Bushido. But at this stage, there is no unified code, there is only convergence. Different regions, different clans, and different lineages develop similar expectations because they are responding to similar conditions. Loyalty, restraint, readiness, and acceptance of mortality emerge not as abstract virtues but as adaptive responses to prolonged instability. Even in this early formation, a paradox is already visible. The samurai are not defined by the absence of fear, but by the increasing sophistication with which fear is managed. The more dangerous the environment, the more refined the internal discipline must become. Over generations, this discipline becomes tradition. Tradition becomes identity, and identity becomes something that appears, from the outside, to resemble fearlessness. Yet the historical reality is more complex. These warriors are not outside fear. They are surrounded by it, shaped by it, and continuously negotiating with it. The origins of their code are therefore not a rejection of vulnerability, but an attempt to live within it without being consumed by it. What later generations will interpret as calmness in the face of death is, in its earliest form, a learned adaptation to a world where death is never far away and never entirely predictable. In this sense, the warrior code does not begin as a moral ideal. It begins as a survival framework. Only later does it become something closer to philosophy. And even then, its foundation remains rooted in the same reality that shaped its earliest practitioners: a world where stability is temporary, loyalty is conditional, and fear is always present, even when it is no longer visible. By the time the samurai identity begins to take recognizable shape, violence in Japan is no longer an exceptional rupture in social order. It has become part of the structure that holds that order together. This shift does not happen suddenly, and it is not declared in any single moment of political change. Instead, it emerges gradually through repetition, through cycles of conflict so frequent that entire generations grow up treating armed confrontation not as an extraordinary event, but as a predictable feature of life. In the centuries leading into the Kamakura period and beyond, the provinces are not simply unstable, they are structurally competitive. Land disputes, inheritance conflicts, and shifting allegiances create conditions where armed enforcement becomes a routine extension of governance. Even in times without large-scale war, smaller acts of violence persist at a steady rhythm. Skirmishes between local clans, retaliatory raids, and disputes over agricultural control create a constant background pressure. In such an environment, the boundary between peace and conflict is not a line, it is a thin, constantly shifting threshold. For the emerging samurai class, this means that life is organized around the expectation of sudden change. A morning can begin with administrative duties and end with mobilization. A negotiation can turn into a standoff. A routine journey can become an ambush. What matters most is not avoiding danger entirely, but maintaining readiness for its arrival in forms that cannot be precisely predicted. This is where fear begins to change its character. In environments of occasional danger, fear tends to spike sharply, overwhelming perception and pushing individuals toward flight or paralysis. But in environments where danger is frequent and distributed, fear becomes less explosive and more continuous. It does not disappear. It stabilizes. It becomes a background condition that must be filtered rather than eliminated. Historical accounts from the late Heian and early Kamakura periods suggest that young warriors were exposed to violence early in their development. Training was not separated from real conflict in the way later military institutions might attempt. Instead, the transition from learning to participation was often gradual and incomplete. A retainer might begin by accompanying older warriors, witnessing skirmishes before directly participating in them. Over time, exposure reduces the shock of violence, not by making it emotionally neutral, but by making it familiar. This familiarity has profound psychological consequences. When violence becomes routine, the human mind reorganizes its expectations. The anticipation of conflict no longer triggers the same level of existential disruption. Instead, it becomes integrated into planning. Decisions are made with the assumption that instability is not an interruption but a recurring condition. At the same time, the social structure reinforces this normalization. Status and survival are directly tied to martial effectiveness. A household that fails to defend its land does not simply lose property. It loses its position within the network of obligations that defines political reality. Alliances are fragile, and loyalty is conditional on performance. In such a system, fear is not only personal, it is collective. The consequences of failure extend beyond the individual to the entire lineage. This collective dimension intensifies the pressure placed on warriors. A single moment of hesitation in battle does not only endanger one life, it risks destabilizing the reputation of an entire family. Reputation, in turn, is not symbolic. It has material consequences: access to land, marriage alliances, and political protection. The result is a system in which emotional restraint is not merely encouraged but structurally enforced. Yet restraint should not be confused with absence. The samurai does not cease to feel fear. Instead, fear is subjected to competing pressures. On one side is instinctive self-preservation, the biological impulse to avoid harm. On the other is social obligation, which demands action even under extreme risk. The tension between these forces produces a distinct psychological state, controlled responsiveness under uncertainty. As warfare becomes more frequent during the transition into the Sengoku period, this state is tested repeatedly. The Sengoku era is often described as a warring states period, but this phrase understates the depth of instability involved. It is not a single war, but a fragmentation of authority across multiple regions, each with its own competing power centers. Castles are built, destroyed, and rebuilt in rapid succession. Borders shift with seasonal campaigns. Entire provinces can change control within a single generation. In this environment, violence is not episodic. It is continuous at a systemic level. Even when not constantly active in every location, the expectation of conflict shapes everything from agricultural planning to marriage arrangements. Villagers fortify themselves. Retainers are always partially mobilized. Even periods of relative calm are understood as temporary pauses rather than true stability. For the samurai, this means that psychological readiness is not an occasional requirement. It is a permanent condition. The mind must remain flexible enough to shift from peace to violence without delay. This does not produce emotional numbness so much as a layered awareness. One part of attention remains grounded in the present moment, while another remains alert to potential disruption. Some historical descriptions of battlefield conduct emphasize composure, but these accounts should not be misread as evidence of emotional absence. Instead, they reflect training in controlling visible reaction. Panic, hesitation, or uncontrolled aggression can all be disadvantageous in structured combat environments. What is valued is precision under pressure, not the elimination of internal response. It is also important to recognize that violence in this period is not only large-scale warfare. It includes executions, punitive raids, ritualized punishments, and internal clan conflicts. These forms of violence reinforce the same psychological framework as battlefield combat. They normalize the presence of death as a tool of governance and social control. One lesser discussed aspect of this environment is the role of witnessing. Many retainers and young warriors would observe executions or the aftermath of battles without directly participating. This repeated exposure contributes to a gradual desensitization, but again, not in the sense of emotional emptiness. Rather, it creates a structured familiarity with death as part of social reality. Bodies, wounds, and loss become integrated into the visual and emotional vocabulary of daily life. At the same time, religious and philosophical frameworks provide interpretive structures for this reality. Buddhist teachings on impermanence gain practical relevance in a world where stability is visibly fragile. The understanding that all things are transient is not abstract, it is observable. Villages are rebuilt after destruction. Families are dissolved and reformed through conflict. Leaders rise and fall with regularity in such a context. Impermanence is not a concept to be contemplated in isolation, but a condition to be lived within. This does not eliminate fear, but it changes its focus. Fear is no longer centered on the inevitability of death alone, but on timing, context, and meaning. To die is expected. To die improperly, dishonorably, or without fulfilling one's obligations becomes the deeper concern. This shift is crucial to understanding later developments in samurai ethics. Training practices during this period further reinforce this structured relationship with violence. Martial instruction emphasizes repetition, form, and controlled response. The goal is not improvisation in the emotional sense, but reliable execution under stress. Weapons training becomes a form of embodied discipline, where reaction is refined until it operates almost independently of conscious deliberation. Yet even with such training, unpredictability remains central. No amount of preparation can fully eliminate uncertainty in battlefield conditions. Weather, terrain, morale, and leadership decisions all influence outcomes in ways that cannot be entirely controlled. This persistent uncertainty ensures that fear never fully disappears. It simply becomes integrated into a broader framework of calculated risk. What emerges from this long period of normalization is a distinctive psychological environment. The samurai do not live without fear. They live within it as a constant background condition, shaped by repetition, reinforced by social structure, and interpreted through philosophical frameworks that give it meaning. Violence is not an interruption of life. It is one of the conditions under which life is organised. Over time, this produces a paradox that later generations will struggle to interpret. From the outside, samurai behaviour can appear calm, even detached. But this calmness is not the absence of internal disturbance. It is the result of long-term adaptation to a world where disturbance is expected. Fear, in this context, is not erased. It is absorbed, structured, and rendered functional. In this sense, violence as daily structure does not create fearlessness. It creates a different relationship with fear altogether, one in which fear is no longer a signal to withdraw from reality, but a constant element within which reality must be navigated. And it is from this foundation that the later ideals of discipline, honour, and controlled death will begin to take form. Long before samurai begin to speak in terms of honour codes or disciplined fearlessness, there is something quieter shaping their inner world, something that does not come from the battlefield directly, but from the way the world itself is understood. It is the idea that nothing remains fixed, that every form of stability is temporary, and that all things, no matter how solid they appear, are already in the process of dissolving. This is not yet a warrior philosophy in any formal sense. It is a cultural atmosphere slowly deepening through centuries of religious transmission, lived experience, and repeated collapse of human certainty. In the medieval Japanese world, Buddhism does not exist as a single unified system imposed from above. It spreads through temples, travelling monks, aristocratic patronage, and local adaptation. By the time warrior rule begins to solidify, Buddhist thought has already become deeply embedded in both elite and provincial life. But what matters most for the samurai is not doctrine in its abstract theological form. It is the way certain ideas map onto lived reality. Among these, no concept becomes more psychologically significant than impermanence. Impermanence, in its simplest articulation, is not complicated. All things change, all things end, all things pass. But in a world of constant provincial conflict, this is not an abstract truth to be contemplated in isolation. It is something that is repeatedly confirmed by experience. Castles are destroyed and rebuilt. Families rise to prominence and disappear within a generation. Seasons of peace are followed by sudden outbreaks of violence. Even landscapes are altered as forests are cleared. Fields are abandoned, and settlements shift location in response to instability. For warriors living within this environment, impermanence becomes less a belief and more a background structure of perception. It shapes how time is understood. The present moment is no longer assumed to extend smoothly into the future. Instead, it is treated as something fragile, always on the edge of disruption. This subtle shift in perception has profound consequences for emotional life. Fear, in such a context, is not simply a reaction to immediate danger. It becomes an awareness of how quickly any condition can collapse. Zen Buddhism, which gains prominence among warrior classes during the Kamakura period, intensifies this relationship between awareness and instability. Unlike more ritual-heavy forms of religious practice, Zen emphasizes direct experience, meditation, and the stripping away of conceptual distraction. Its influence does not replace earlier beliefs, but adds another layer of discipline to mental life. For samurai, this becomes particularly relevant because it reframes attention itself as something that can be trained. Meditation practices associated with Zen do not eliminate fear. Instead, they encourage observation of mental states without immediate reaction. In a world where hesitation can be dangerous, this form of mental discipline offers a way to stabilize internal response. The goal is not emotional absence, but reduced fragmentation of attention under pressure. A mind that does not scatter easily is a mind that can act decisively even when uncertainty is high. Yet the philosophical dimension of impermanence extends beyond meditation halls. It appears in literature, poetry, and everyday expressions. The famous sensitivity to seasonal change in Japanese aesthetics, for example, is not merely artistic. It reflects a deeper cultural recognition that beauty is inseparable from transience. Blossoms are valued precisely because they fall. Snow is admired because it melts. This aesthetic orientation subtly reinforces the same worldview that warriors encounter in more violent forms. Nothing persists unchanged. For the samurai, this aesthetic sensibility intersects with lived experience in a way that is difficult to separate from survival psychology. When life is repeatedly exposed to sudden loss, the idea that permanence is an illusion becomes not only acceptable but intuitive. What differs is not whether impermanence is understood, but how it is internalized. For some, it becomes a source of detachment. For others, it becomes a source of a heightened urgency. Historical records from the Kamakura and Muromachi period suggest that warriors often expressed awareness of life's fragility in moments of reflection before battle or during periods of withdrawal from conflict. These expressions are not necessarily philosophical in a formal sense. They are acknowledgements of condition. Life is short, outcomes are uncertain, control is limited. What remains is action within constraints. This recognition does not lead uniformly to calmness. It can also intensify emotional stakes. If all things are transient, then actions carry weight precisely because they are temporary. Honour, once established, must be maintained within a limited time frame. Reputation, once lost, may not be easily recovered. Even life itself, being finite, gains intensity from its finitude. Impermanence does not reduce significance, it concentrates it. Within this framework, fear undergoes another subtle transformation. It is no longer only a response to physical threat or social consequence. It also becomes a recognition of fragility itself. The awareness that any situation can dissolve at any moment creates a constant low-level tension. Yet this tension is not always experienced as panic. Over time, it can become normalized, even integrated into composure. The integration of Buddhist impermanence into warrior life is not uniform across all regions or periods. There are variations in interpretation, practice, and emphasis. Some warriors adopt more formal religious discipline, while others engage with these ideas more indirectly through cultural exposure. Scholars still debate the extent to which Zen philosophy directly shaped battlefield behavior versus how much it was later projected backward by idealized accounts. What is clear, however, is that the conceptual language of impermanence becomes increasingly intertwined with how warrior conduct is later described and understood. One important aspect of this integration is the way it reframes attachment. In a world of constant instability, strong emotional attachment to outcomes, possessions, or even life itself can become a source of vulnerability. This does not mean that attachment disappears, rather, it becomes managed, regulated, and sometimes deliberately restrained. The ability to act without being paralyzed by potential loss becomes a valued form of discipline. This does not eliminate grief, ambition, or fear. Instead, it places them within a broader cognitive framework where they are acknowledged but not allowed to fully determine action. The warrior learns, through repetition and cultural reinforcement, that emotional intensity must be balanced with operational clarity. In this sense, impermanence is not only a philosophical insight but a practical tool for maintaining effectiveness in unstable conditions. At the same time, the presence of impermanence as a cultural idea creates a subtle paradox. If everything is transient, then even the systems designed to manage transience are themselves temporary. Clans rise and fall, codes evolve, even religious institutions change over time. This recursive instability reinforces the sense that no structure is permanently secure. For samurai, this reinforces the necessity of adaptability, both physically and mentally. As the Kamakura shogunate establishes warrior governance more formally, this philosophical background begins to merge with administrative and military expectations. Loyalty, discipline, and readiness are no longer just practical requirements. They are increasingly framed in terms that resonate with the idea of impermanence. To act correctly in a transient world is to act without excessive attachment to outcome, while still fully engaging with responsibility. This tension defines much of samurai psychology: engagement without attachment, action without certainty, awareness without paralysis. Fear, within this structure, is neither rejected nor indulged. It is observed, regulated, and redirected into functional awareness. The presence of impermanence does not remove fear from existence, it reshapes its role within it. What emerges from this long interaction between philosophy and lived experience is not a simple doctrine of fearlessness, but a more complex psychological orientation. The samurai do not stand outside fear, they stand within a worldview that continuously reminds them of instability, while also demanding that they act decisively within it. Impermanence, in this sense, is not a distant metaphysical idea. It is the silent background against which every decision is made. And it is from this background that later developments in ritual discipline, martial training, and ethical codification will begin to crystallize, transforming lived awareness into structured expectation, and structured expectation into what later generations will recognize, often simplistically, as the warrior's calm in the face of death. The word Bushido is often treated as if it were an ancient, fully formed code that guided samurai behavior from the very beginning of their existence. In reality, what later becomes known by that name is not a single invention, but a gradual convergence of expectations, habits, and moral interpretations that develop across centuries of conflict, adaptation, and political consolidation. It is less a blueprint handed down from a single source, and more a reflection written backward onto a long history of lived practice. By the time warrior rule stabilizes under the Kamakura shogunate, the samurai class already possesses a shared set of behavioral expectations. These expectations are not yet systematized into a formal doctrine, but they are widely understood within warrior society. Loyalty to one's lord, readiness for combat, restraint in behavior, and acceptance of mortality are not abstract ideals. They are practical necessities shaped by the conditions of survival in a fragmented political landscape. What begins to change over time is not the existence of these values, but the way they are interpreted and justified. As political authority becomes more centralized, and periods of large-scale warfare fluctuate between intensity and relative calm, there emerges a need to define what it means to be a warrior beyond immediate battlefield function. This is where philosophical, religious, and literary influences begin to shape a more articulated identity. Confucian thought, which emphasizes hierarchy, duty, and structured relationships, provides one of the key frameworks for this development. Imported from continental Asia and adapted through centuries of Japanese interpretation, Confucian ideas do not replace existing warrior values, but they give them a language of moral order. Loyalty is no longer only a practical necessity for survival. It becomes framed as an ethical obligation rooted in the proper functioning of social hierarchy. A lord is not simply a military leader, he becomes a figure of legitimate authority within a structured moral universe. At the same time, Buddhist influence continues to shape the internal dimension of warrior identity. Impermanence, already deeply embedded in cultural perception, now interacts with ideas of duty and conduct. The result is a layered psychological framework in which action is guided by obligation, while awareness is tempered by the understanding that all outcomes are temporary. This combination produces distinctive tension. One must act decisively in a world where nothing is ultimately permanent. As the Muromachi period unfolds, this tension becomes more visible. Political authority is less stable than in the Kamakura era, and regional warlords gain increasing autonomy. The Ashikaga shogunate struggles to maintain centralized control, leading to a gradual decentralization of power. In this environment, warrior identity becomes even more important as a stabilizing force. Without consistent institutional authority, shared values among warriors help maintain coherence within an otherwise fragmented system. It is during this period that early formulations of what will later be called Bushido begin to appear more explicitly in writing. However, these texts do not describe a single unified code. They reflect different regional perspectives, different philosophical influences, and different political needs. Some emphasize loyalty above all else, others stress martial skill, strategic intelligence, or moral refinement. What they share is not uniform doctrine, but a common attempt to define what makes warrior conduct legitimate. One of the most important features of this emerging framework is the elevation of loyalty to a central moral position. Loyalty, in earlier periods, had been largely transactional and situational, shaped by mutual benefit and survival. Over time, it becomes increasingly idealized. The relationship between retainer and lord is reinterpreted not simply as an arrangement of power, but as a moral bond that transcends immediate circumstance. This does not eliminate betrayal or shifting alliances, which continue throughout Japanese history, but it reframes them as violations of an emerging ethical expectation. This reframing has direct implications for how fear is understood. If loyalty is absolute, then failure in loyalty carries consequences that extend beyond physical survival. It becomes a matter of identity and moral worth. The fear experienced by samurai in this context is therefore not limited to battlefield danger. It includes the fear of dishonor, of failure to fulfill obligation, and of social erasure within the warrior hierarchy. At the same time, martial training becomes increasingly formalized, techniques are refined, schools of swordsmanship develop, and instruction becomes more systematized. This formalization contributes to the impression of discipline and control that later generations associate with samurai behavior. However, this discipline is not simply technical, it is also psychological. Training is designed to reduce hesitation, to create consistent responses under pressure, and to ensure that fear does not translate into paralysis at critical moments. Within these training environments, repetition plays a central role. Movements are practiced until they become embodied patterns rather than conscious decisions. This embodiment is crucial in high-stress environments where cognitive overload can interfere with reaction time. The goal is not to eliminate fear, but to ensure that fear does not interrupt execution. In this sense, training functions as a bridge between internal emotional experience and external action. Religious and philosophical influences continue to reinforce this structure. Zen practice, where present, encourages a form of mental clarity that aligns with the demands of martial responsiveness. Confucian ethics reinforce the importance of role fulfillment within hierarchy. Indigenous Shinto traditions contribute an additional layer of ritualized respect for place, duty, and continuity. Together, these influences do not form a single unified system, but they converge in their effect on behavior and self-perception. By the late Muromachi period, especially as the Sengoku era intensifies, the conditions of warfare further accelerate the need for coherent behavioral expectations. Large-scale conflicts involving multiple domains require coordination, discipline, and reliable loyalty under unpredictable conditions. In such an environment, reputational systems become increasingly important. A warrior's reliability is not only judged by isolated actions, but by sustained patterns of conduct over time. It is in this context that the idea of a recognizable warrior ethos becomes more concrete. While the term Bushido itself will only be fully systematized later, the foundations of what it represents are already present. These foundations are not uniform rules, but shared assumptions about how a warrior should behave in situations where survival, loyalty, and honor intersect under pressure. One of the key tensions within this emerging ethos is the relationship between emotion and action. Emotional response is not eliminated, but it is subordinated to duty. Fear, in particular, is treated as something that must be managed rather than expressed. Open displays of fear are often associated with loss of control, which can undermine both individual effectiveness and collective cohesion. As a result, emotional discipline becomes an essential component of martial identity. However, this does not mean that samurai are emotionally detached in the modern sense of the term. Rather, emotional experience is filtered through layers of expectation and training. Fear may still be present internally, but its outward expression is constrained by social and professional norms. Over time, this creates a cultural pattern in which restraint is interpreted as absence, even when it is actually a form of regulation. The emergence of Bushido as a conceptual framework therefore does not mark the creation of fearlessness. Instead, it marks the codification of how fear is to be managed within a specific social and historical context. It transforms accumulated practices into articulated expectations, and those expectations into a shared identity that can be transmitted across generations. Yet even at this stage, the system remains fluid. Different domains interpret these values differently. Different schools of thought emphasize different aspects of conduct. The idea of a single unified Bushido code is, in many ways, a retrospective simplification imposed by later historians and cultural narratives. What actually exists is a complex, evolving set of overlapping expectations shaped by centuries of lived experience. Within this complexity, fear continues to operate as a constant, though increasingly regulated, presence. It is not removed from samurai life. It is structured within it. And as this structure becomes more defined, it lays the groundwork for the more rigid interpretations of honor, death, and loyalty that will come to characterize later periods of Japanese warrior culture. In the world that produces samurai culture, death is not an abstract endpoint placed at the far edge of life. It is a recurring possibility embedded in ordinary decisions, and over time this changes not only how warriors act, but how they are trained to think. The process of becoming a samurai is not simply a matter of learning technique. It is a long and deliberate conditioning of perception itself, shaping how the mind registers danger, consequence, and the boundary between life and its sudden disappearance. Training begins early, often within household structures where martial expectation is present long before formal instruction. A young retainer grows up observing weapons, rituals, and hierarchical behavior patterns that signal what is expected later. By the time structured training begins, the idea of risk is already normalized. What remains is refinement, the shaping of instinct into controlled response. Martial schools during the Muromachi and Sengoku periods develop increasingly sophisticated methods for this refinement. Swordsmanship is not taught as isolated technique alone, but as a system of embodied awareness. Repetition is central, not because it builds strength in a mechanical sense, but because it reduces the space between perception and action. In high-risk environments, hesitation is not just delay, it is vulnerability. Yet beneath the physical training lies a deeper objective. The mind itself must be conditioned to remain functional under the presence of mortality. This does not mean eliminating awareness of death. It means integrating it so fully that it no longer disrupts action. Warriors are not trained to forget that they may die. They are trained to operate as if that possibility is already accounted for. This is where philosophical and religious influences become structurally important. Zen practice, where adopted, offers a framework for stabilizing attention. Meditation does not remove fear, but it creates a space in which fear can be observed without immediate reaction. In combat conditions, this translates into a reduced fragmentation of awareness. Instead of being pulled entirely into panic or anticipation, the mind maintains a form of anchored presence. At the same time, Buddhist teachings on impermanence reinforce the acceptance of mortality as a constant condition. When life is understood as inherently transient, death loses some of its psychological shock value. It is no longer an anomaly that disrupts expectation, but a continuation of an already recognized truth. This does not produce emotional indifference, but it changes the structure of emotional response. Confucian influence adds another layer, focusing not on death itself but on role fulfillment. A warrior is not defined by whether he lives or dies, but by whether he fulfills the obligations attached to his position. This reframing is crucial. It shifts attention away from survival as the highest value and toward conduct within a given role. In such a framework, fear is still present, but it is no longer the primary determinant of action. Training methods reflect this layered worldview. Sparring practices, drills, and ritualized repetition are designed to simulate pressure without replicating the full chaos of battle. The goal is controlled exposure enough stress to activate fear responses, but not enough to overwhelm them. Over time, repeated exposure recalibrates the nervous system's threshold for threat, allowing warriors to remain operational under conditions that would otherwise trigger collapse. However, it's important not to misunderstand this process as simple desensitization. The objective is not emotional numbness. Historical accounts and later martial writing suggest that awareness remains acute. What changes is the relationship between awareness and action. Fear is still registered, but it is prevented from interrupting execution. This distinction becomes especially important when examining accounts of battlefield behavior during the Sengoku period. Descriptions of composure under fire should not be interpreted as absence of fear, but as evidence of trained response overriding instinctive hesitation. The body reacts, but training structures the outcome of that reaction. In many warrior lineages, formal instruction is also accompanied by exposure to real consequences at an early stage. While later romanticized narratives may exaggerate this aspect, there is evidence that young retainers were sometimes brought into proximity with violence not as participants, but as observers. Witnessing injury, death, and aftermath serves as a form of psychological conditioning that cannot be replicated in controlled environments. This exposure contributes to a gradual shift in perception. Death becomes less of an unknown and more of a known quantity. The unknown tends to amplify fear because it invites imagination to fill gaps. Once those gaps are filled with experience, fear changes shape. It becomes more specific, more situational, and less overwhelming in its abstraction. Yet even within this structured environment, unpredictability remains central. No amount of training can fully account for the variability of real combat conditions. Terrain, weather, fatigue, leadership decisions, and chance all influence outcomes in ways that cannot be fully rehearsed. This ensures that fear is never completely eliminated from the system. It remains present as a background condition that must be continuously managed. The idea of training the mind for death also intersects with ritual practice. In some traditions, warriors engage in reflective exercises that simulate the mental state of facing mortality directly. This is not intended as morbidity, but as stabilization. By confronting the idea of death in controlled settings, the mind reduces its tendency to react with shock when that idea becomes real. Seppuku, although often discussed separately as a ritual of death, is also indirectly connected to this mental framework. The existence of a structured, culturally recognised form of voluntary death reflects a worldview in which the manner of dying can be subject to discipline and meaning. While not all samurai participated in such acts, its presence within the culture reinforces the idea that death itself is not outside the scope of trained conduct. Across these different layers, physical training, philosophical conditioning, observational exposure, and ritualized reflection, a consistent pattern emerges. The goal is not to remove fear, but to integrate it into a stable system of response. Fear is acknowledged as inevitable, but its influence is regulated through repetition, expectation, and meaning. This produces a form of psychological duality. On one level, the warrior remains fully capable of experiencing fear in its immediate physiological form. On another level, he is trained to recognize that fear without allowing it to dictate action. The space between these two levels is where martial discipline operates. Over time, this conditioning becomes so deeply embedded that it can appear, from the outside, as fearlessness. But this appearance is deceptive. What is actually present is a highly structured relationship with uncertainty. The samurai does not stand outside fear. He stands within a system designed to keep fear from becoming disruptive. As the Sengoku period intensifies, this system is tested repeatedly. Large-scale battles, shifting alliances, and prolonged campaigns create conditions in which training must be constantly applied under real pressure. It is in these environments that the distinction between instinct and discipline becomes most visible. Moments of calm under extreme danger are not accidents of temperament. They are the product of sustained psychological conditioning. And yet, even at the highest levels of training and experience, uncertainty remains. No warrior can fully predict how he will respond in every situation. This lingering unpredictability is part of what keeps fear structurally present within samurai life. It is not eliminated by discipline, it is managed through it, held in tension with action, and continuously negotiated in the space between thought and movement. In this way, training the mind for death does not create invulnerability, it creates adaptability under the constant awareness of vulnerability. And it is from this carefully constructed balance that the later ideals of composure, loyalty, and controlled acceptance of fate will continue to evolve, shaping both historical reality and the mythology that grows around it. In the Sengoku world, stone and wood do not represent permanence. They represent time bought at a cost. A castle is not a symbol of safety in the modern sense, but a temporary structure of resistance, designed to delay collapse rather than prevent it entirely. Every wall, every gate, every moat exists under the assumption that it may one day be tested, breached, or burned. For the samurai, this environment creates a very specific psychological condition even in moments of stillness. Threat is never absent, it is simply waiting. Castle towns grow around this logic of anticipated violence. They are not built as peaceful centres that occasionally face war. They are built as defensive ecosystems that also happen to contain civilian life. Roads are arranged for controlled movement. Storehouses are positioned for siege endurance. Watch points are integrated into daily sightlines. Even ordinary activity takes place within structures shaped by military expectation. Over time, inhabitants learn to live inside geometry that assumes conflict as a default possibility. For the warrior class, this architecture reinforces a constant state of readiness. A lord's residence is not only a political centre, but a command structure that can shift into wartime function without delay. Retainers understand their positions not only in terms of hierarchy, but in terms of spatial responsibility. Where one stands in a castle is also where one stands in a potential emergency. Fear in such an environment is not episodic, it is spatially distributed. Siege warfare intensifies this condition further. Unlike open field battles, sieges stretch time. They compress uncertainty into days, weeks, sometimes months, where action is intermittent but anticipation is continuous. Within a besieged castle, every sound becomes meaningful, every supply calculation carries weight, every rumour of enemy movement alters behaviour. The psychological pressure is not driven by constant fighting, but by the suspension of resolution. Historical accounts from major Sengoku conflicts describe how morale inside castles could shift not through immediate combat, but through gradual depletion of resources and certainty. Hunger, fatigue, and isolation become as significant as enemy weapons. Under these conditions, fear changes its form again. It is no longer simply fear of injury or death in a moment of battle. It becomes fear of inevitability, of gradual collapse that cannot be precisely timed but is clearly approaching. Samurai operating within sieges are therefore forced into an unusual mental rhythm. Action is punctuated by waiting. Waiting is punctuated by preparation. Preparation is punctuated by brief, intense moments of combat or negotiation. This rhythm creates a heightened sensitivity to small changes in environment. A shift in wind direction, a distant movement on the horizon, or a change in messenger frequency can all carry strategic implications. Within such a system, emotional regulation becomes not only a personal discipline but a functional necessity. Panic spreads quickly in confined, high-stress environments. A single breakdown in composure can influence collective morale. As a result, warriors are trained not only for individual response but for maintaining behavioural stability in others. Leadership in this context is partly psychological containment. Yet even the most disciplined structures cannot fully eliminate uncertainty. Siege outcomes often depend on factors beyond direct control, weather disruptions, supply failures, unexpected reinforcements, or internal betrayal. The awareness of these variables creates a persistent undercurrent of tension. Samurai are not simply defending walls, they are defending against the possibility that control itself may be lost. In this way, castles become mirrors of internal psychological structures. Just as walls are layered, reinforced, and monitored, so too is the mind trained to manage layered uncertainty. External defences reflect internal discipline. The more unpredictable the external environment, the more structured the internal response must become. One of the lesser discussed aspects of siege environments is the role of weighting as psychological pressure. Modern perspectives often emphasise action in warfare, but in Sengoku sieges, inaction carries its own weight. Hours spent watching without movement, nights spent sleeping lightly, and days spent interpreting incomplete information all contribute to a state where anticipation becomes almost physical. Fear in this context is not a sudden surge. It is a continuous presence shaped by time itself. Within castles, hierarchy also plays a crucial role in managing this pressure. Orders are not simply operational directives, they are stabilising mechanisms. Clear authority reduces uncertainty by narrowing possible interpretations of events. In moments of crisis, ambiguity is more dangerous than danger itself. Samurai are trained to respond quickly not only to threats, but to instructions that define how threats should be understood. However, even hierarchy cannot fully shield individuals from psychological strain. Prolonged sieges often test loyalty in subtle ways. When resources become scarce, when relief forces fail to arrive, and when outcomes remain unclear, the distinction between duty and survival becomes increasingly strained. It is in these moments that the deeper structure of samurai identity is revealed, not in moments of victory, but in the endurance of uncertainty. Some historical episodes from the Sengoku period describe defenders' continuing resistance, even when outcomes appear effectively decided. These moments are often later interpreted through the lens of honour or ideological commitment, but at the experiential level, they also reflect the absence of viable alternatives within a collapsing system. Fear does not disappear in such situations, it becomes reorganised around inevitability and meaning. At the same time, siege environments also produce moments of unexpected calm. Long periods of waiting can normalise even extreme conditions. Human perception adapts to sustained stress by recalibrating what is considered urgent. In this sense, fear is not constant in intensity, even if it is constant in presence. It rises and falls in relation to perceived immediacy, while never fully leaving the system. This fluctuating rhythm creates a distinctive psychological landscape for samurai. They are neither permanently in combat nor fully at rest. They exist in a state of structured anticipation, where readiness is continuous but action is intermittent. Over time, this condition becomes internalized, shaping not only behavior but identity. The architecture of castles, the structure of sieges, and the unpredictability of warfare all converge to reinforce a central reality. Control is always partial. No matter how strong the defenses, no matter how disciplined the defenders, uncertainty remains embedded in the situation. For samurai, this awareness is not theoretical. It is lived repeatedly across generations of conflict. And it is within this lived repetition that fear is continuously reshaped. Not removed, not conquered, but reorganized into forms that can coexist with sustained responsibility. Castles may eventually fall, sieges may end in surrender or victory, but the psychological framework developed within them persists. It becomes part of how warriors understand not only war, but existence under conditions where stability is never guaranteed. In this way, castles are not only military structures, they are training grounds for endurance under uncertainty, and sieges are not only battles of force, they are extended lessons in living with fear that cannot be resolved, only managed, contained, and carried forward. In the world of samurai warfare, survival is never a simple instinctual priority. It exists in constant tension with something far more socially demanding: loyalty. Unlike fear, which is internal and immediate, loyalty is external and enduring. It ties a warrior not only to the present moment, but to a network of obligations that stretch across time, hierarchy, and reputation. And in many cases, this network becomes powerful enough to override the most basic drive to preserve one's own life. To understand this dynamic, it is necessary to see loyalty not as a romantic ideal imposed later by tradition, but as a structural necessity born from unstable political conditions. In the Sengoku period, alliances shift frequently. Lords rise and fall, territories change hands. In such a fluid environment, trust becomes both essential and fragile. A warrior's reliability is measured not only in combat performance, but in consistency of allegiance under pressure. This creates a psychological environment where fear is never experienced in isolation. The fear of death is always accompanied by the fear of dishonor, betrayal, or failure of duty. In some cases, these fears conflict directly. To retreat may preserve life but destroy reputation. To advance may risk life but preserve obligation. The samurai is often positioned at the intersection of these opposing forces, where every action carries irreversible consequences in multiple dimensions. Within this structure, survival is no longer the highest organizing principle. It becomes one variable among others, weighed against loyalty, expectation, and social consequence. This does not mean that the instinct for survival disappears. It remains present, powerful, and biologically grounded, but it is continuously negotiated against culturally reinforced priorities. Historical records from the Sengoku era show repeated instances where retainers continued fighting, even in situations where retreat would have been tactically reasonable. Later interpretations often frame these actions in terms of unwavering courage or devotion. While these explanations are not entirely incorrect, they can obscure the more complex reality decisions were often shaped by layered pressures where individual survival was inseparable from collective outcomes. A samurai does not operate as an isolated unit. He exists within a web of obligations that includes his lord, his household, his retainers, and his reputation within the broader warrior class. Failure in one domain can cascade into others. A retreat that preserves life might still result in the destruction of one's family standing or the loss of future political protection. In such a system, fear is distributed across multiple possible consequences rather than concentrated solely on death. This distribution of fear changes its behaviour. Instead of triggering simple fight or flight responses, it creates situations where no option is free from risk. Loyalty becomes a stabilising force within this uncertainty. It provides a framework that prioritises certain outcomes over others, even when those outcomes involve personal harm. The philosophical background for this prioritisation is reinforced by Confucian ethics, which emphasise hierarchical relationships and duty. Within this framework, a lord is not merely a superior in a military chain of command, but a moral centre of obligation. Loyalty is therefore not just strategic, it is ethical. To abandon a lord in battle is not only a tactical decision, it is a violation of the expected order of relationships. Buddhist influence, particularly the awareness of impermanence, further complicates this structure. If life itself is transient, then the significance of how one acts within that life becomes more prominent. The duration of existence is less important than the manner in which it is lived. This does not eliminate fear of death, but it reframes it within a larger temporal perspective. What matters is not simply survival, but the quality and meaning of action under conditions of uncertainty. In practice, this produces a layered psychological hierarchy. At the base is biological fear, the immediate reaction to danger. Above it is social fear, the concern for reputation and consequence. Above that is ethical obligation, the internalized expectation of loyalty and duty. These layers do not replace one another. They interact continuously, sometimes reinforcing each other, sometimes conflicting. Training and cultural conditioning work to stabilize this hierarchy. From an early stage, warriors are taught that loyalty is not situational, but foundational. Stories, rituals, and examples from historical figures reinforce the idea that honorable conduct often requires sacrifice. These narratives are not always historically uniform or consistent, but they serve a functional role in shaping expectations. However, it is important not to interpret this system as one that eliminates self-preservation entirely. Samurai culture does not reject survival instinct. Rather, it places it within a hierarchy of competing values. In some situations, retreat is acceptable or even expected. In others, it is considered unacceptable regardless of personal risk. The key variable is context, and context is defined by obligation. This complexity is one reason why samurai behaviour cannot be reduced to simple notions of fearlessness. A warrior who stands his ground is not necessarily without fear. He may be operating under a structure where the consequences of withdrawal outweigh the consequences of danger. His decision is not the absence of fear, but the resolution of competing fears. As the Sengoku period progresses, these dynamics become increasingly intense. Warfare becomes more large-scale, more coordinated, and more dependent on disciplined units of retainers. Loyalty is no longer only a personal virtue. It becomes a functional requirement for maintaining military effectiveness. Armies rely on predictable behaviour from their members, especially under chaotic conditions. This reliance reinforces the moral framing of loyalty. It is no longer simply about personal honour or philosophical ideal. It becomes embedded in the practical survival of entire domains. A single act of disloyalty can have cascading effects that destabilise alliances and alter the balance of power. Yet even within the system, loyalty is not absolute in practice. History records numerous instances of shifting allegiances, betrayals, and pragmatic realignments. The ideal of unwavering loyalty exists alongside the reality of strategic adaptation. This tension between ideal and practice contributes further to the psychological complexity of samurai decision-making. Fear, in this environment, is constantly mediated by calculation. But calculation is never purely rational. It is influenced by emotion, memory, training, and expectation. The result is a form of decision-making that operates under pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. Over time, the repeated experience of resolving these pressures shapes identity itself. A samurai does not simply act loyally. He begins to understand himself as someone for whom loyalty is a defining feature of existence. This internalization is crucial. It transforms external expectation into internal motivation, reducing the psychological friction between fear and duty. Still, the underlying tension never fully disappears. Loyalty may guide action, but it does not erase the cost of action. Every decision made under these conditions carries weight, and that weight accumulates across a lifetime of service, conflict, and uncertainty. In this sense, loyalty above survival is not a denial of fear. It is a reordering of fear's priorities. Death remains feared, but it is no longer the only or even the dominant concern. What matters just as much is what death signifies within a network of relationships and expectations that define the samurai's place in the world. And it is within this intricate balance of survival, obligation, and identity that the later codification of warrior ethics will continue to evolve, gradually shaping the image of the samurai as figures who appear to stand beyond fear, even while living entirely within its structure. In the hands of a samurai, a sword is never just a tool. It is not simply a weapon designed for efficiency or survival. Over centuries of cultural and psychological development, it becomes something far more integrated into the identity of its wielder, until the boundary between man and blade begins to blur in both symbolic language and lived perception. To understand why samurai appear, in later tradition, almost inseparable from their swords, it is necessary to see how the object itself becomes a focal point where fear, discipline, and identity converge. The katana, as it becomes standardized in later periods, is shaped by both practical and symbolic pressures. Its curved form, its balance, its precision all reflect the realities of close combat in a world where armor evolves and battlefield dynamics shift constantly. But beyond its physical design, the sword is also embedded within a system of ritual meaning that elevates it far above mere functionality. It is carried, maintained, and treated with a level of respect that reflects its role as an extension of the warrior's self. From early training, a samurai learns that the sword is not external to him in the way other tools might be. It is always present, always accounted for, always integrated into movement and posture. The rituals of drawing, cleaning, and sheathing are not incidental habits. They are part of a disciplined relationship that reinforces awareness, control, and readiness. Over time, this repeated interaction creates a psychological association between the sword and the self, where the object begins to function as a stabilizing anchor for identity under stress. In a world where fear is constant but must be managed, such anchors become essential. The sword provides not only physical capability but psychological continuity. In moments of uncertainty, it is a known constant. It is something that responds predictably to the warrior's intent, something that does not shift allegiance, something that remains under control even when the external world does not. This stability becomes particularly important during the Sengoku period, where rapid changes in allegiance, battlefield conditions, and territorial control create an environment of extreme unpredictability. In such a world, objects that can be fully controlled gain symbolic weight. The sword is sharpened, maintained, and carried not only because it is useful, but because it represents a sphere of order within chaos. The psychological relationship between warrior and sword is reinforced by cultural narratives that emerge over time. Tales of exceptional skill, decisive strikes, and moments of clarity under pressure circulate widely, shaping expectations of what mastery looks like. These narratives often emphasize precision, timing, and composure, reinforcing the idea that the sword responds not only to physical movement, but to mental state. However, it is important to recognize that this symbolic elevation does not eliminate fear. Instead, it provides a framework through which fear can be organized. A warrior gripping his sword before battle is not necessarily free from fear. He is often fully aware of mortality, uncertainty, and consequence. What the sword offers is not protection from fear, but a focal point through which fear can be channeled into action. The maintenance of the sword further deepens this relationship. Cleaning and caring for the blade is a routine practice that requires attention, patience, and precision. These acts are not purely practical. They are repeated exercises in discipline, reinforcing the idea that control over the sword reflects control over oneself. Neglecting the sword is not only a technical failure, but a symbolic failure of readiness. Over time, this continuous interaction produces a form of embodied identity. The samurai does not simply use the sword, he inhabits a relationship with it that shapes posture, movement, and perception. The awareness of its presence becomes integrated into bodily awareness itself. In this sense, the sword is not outside the self. It is part of the structure through which the self is experienced. This integration is further reinforced by the social and political significance of swords within samurai culture. The possession of a sword is not merely practical, but emblematic of status. It signifies belonging to a specific class with defined obligations and expectations. In certain periods, regulations even govern the types of swords that may be carried, further emphasizing their role as markers of identity rather than simple weapons. Within this framework, fear is once again transformed. The possibility of losing one's sword is not only a material loss but a symbolic disruption. It represents a break in continuity between identity and action. To be disarmed is not just to be vulnerable physically, but to be separated from a core element of self-definition. Yet even with this deep symbolic integration, the sword does not eliminate uncertainty. On the contrary, it exists within it. No blade guarantees victory. No level of skill removes the unpredictability of combat. The sword can fail. The body can fail. The situation can shift in ways that render even perfect technique insufficient. This persistent uncertainty ensures that fear remains structurally embedded in every moment of potential conflict. What the sword does provide is structure within that uncertainty. It is a medium through which training, discipline, and intention are expressed in a world that cannot be fully controlled. It allows fear to be translated into action rather than paralysis. In this way, it becomes less a tool of dominance and more a mechanism of adaptation. As samurai culture evolves, literary and philosophical interpretations of the sword begin to deepen its symbolic weight even further. It becomes associated not only with martial capability, but with moral clarity, decisiveness, and the ability to act without hesitation. These associations are not purely descriptive, they are aspirational, shaping how warriors are expected to behave under pressure. However, historical reality remains more complex. The relationship between warrior and weapon is always mediated by context, training, and circumstance. Fear does not disappear at the moment a sword is drawn. Instead, it becomes concentrated into the immediacy of action. The blade does not remove hesitation from existence, it provides a framework within which hesitation must be resolved. In later periods, especially as warfare declines during the Edo era, the symbolic function of the sword becomes even more pronounced. As direct battlefield experience diminishes, the sword shifts further into the realm of identity, ritual, and representation. It becomes a reminder of a past in which fear and discipline were constantly tested against real danger. Yet even in this symbolic transformation, the underlying psychological structure remains. The sword continues to represent a point of convergence between fear and control, uncertainty and discipline, mortality and action. It embodies the tension that has defined samurai existence from its earliest formation, the need to act decisively in a world where outcomes are never fully known. In this sense, the sword is not only a weapon or a symbol, it is a continuous reminder of the conditions under which samurai identity was formed, conditions in which fear was never absent, but always present in a form that had to be managed, structured, and ultimately transformed into action. And it is from this convergence of object, identity, and discipline that the later mythology of the samurai as figures of unwavering composure continues to grow, even as the reality behind that image remains far more complex, human, and deeply bound to the persistent presence of fear. In every long era of samurai warfare, there are moments when structure breaks faster than it can be repaired. Campaigns that begin with clear hierarchies of command suddenly dissolve into fragmented engagements, where communication fails, alliances shift in real time, and even the most disciplined formations are forced to adapt to conditions no training could fully anticipate. These are the moments that reveal something essential about the warrior world beneath its codes, rituals, and carefully constructed expectations. There is always the possibility of sudden collapse. The Sengoku period is particularly defined by these ruptures. Large battles are not isolated events, but accumulations of smaller tensions that eventually converge. When they break, they do so in ways that are rarely clean or predictable. A battlefield that appears stable at dawn can become disordered by midday. A coordinated advance can turn into scattered resistance within hours. In such environments, fear is no longer a background condition or a controlled presence. It becomes immediate, widespread, and physically overwhelming. Yet even within chaos, samurai behavior does not reduce to simple panic or uniform reaction. What emerges instead is a spectrum of responses shaped by training, hierarchy, and experience. Some warriors maintain formation under collapsing conditions, relying on drilled patterns that persist even when strategic coherence is lost. Others shift rapidly between retreat and engagement depending on localized opportunities. Still others become absorbed into smaller units of resistance that no longer reflect original command structures. What is important in these moments is not the absence of fear, but the way fear is processed under extreme disruption. In stable environments, fear can be managed through expectation and preparation. In chaotic environments, those stabilizing frameworks begin to dissolve. The mind is forced to rely on more immediate forms of judgment, often under conditions of incomplete information. Historical accounts of major Sengoku battles often describe this breakdown not as total disorder, but as layered fragmentation. Even when central command structures fail, localized discipline can persist. Small groups of warriors may continue fighting according to training long after broader coordination has collapsed. This creates a paradoxical situation, where order and disorder coexist within the same battlefield, shifting constantly depending on proximity and circumstance. In these conditions, fear becomes highly situational. It is no longer distributed evenly across a long campaign or managed through anticipation. Instead, it spikes and recedes in response to immediate stimuli, the sudden loss of a commander, an unexpected flank, the collapse of a defensive position. The nervous system operates in rapid cycles of escalation and adaptation. One of the defining characteristics of such moments is the collapse of reliable interpretation. In structured warfare, information flows through hierarchy. Orders define meaning. Movement is coordinated through shared understanding. When this system breaks down, interpretation becomes individual and fragmented. Warriors must assess situations without full context, relying on partial visibility and instinct shaped by prior training. This is where the depth of earlier conditioning becomes most visible. Training in repetition, discipline, and controlled response does not eliminate confusion, but it provides fallback structures. Even when strategic understanding fails, embodied habits remain. A trained response can persist even when conscious planning is no longer possible. In this sense, earlier training acts as a form of psychological infrastructure that supports action under collapse. However, not all responses are stabilizing. Chaos also amplifies uncertainty. Misinterpretation becomes more likely. Friendly and hostile movements can become indistinguishable in the confusion of battle. Rumors, signals, and partial observations spread rapidly, sometimes accelerating disorder rather than reducing it. Fear in such environments is contagious, not in a symbolic sense, but as a direct consequence of shared exposure to unpredictable stimuli. Some historical narratives describe moments where entire formations disintegrate, not because of a single decisive blow, but through cumulative breakdowns in perception and coordination. Once confidence in structure is lost, even small disruptions can trigger larger withdrawals. This cascading effect is one of the most psychologically significant aspects of pre-modern warfare. Stability is not only physical but perceptual, and when perception fractures, physical outcomes follow. Yet even in these conditions, complete dissolution is rare. More often, what emerges is reorganization at smaller scales. Units reform spontaneously. Leadership shifts locally based on visibility and proximity rather than formal rank. Survival depends less on grand strategy and more on immediate responsiveness within shrinking circles of control. For samurai, these moments of collapse reveal a truth that structured training alone cannot fully obscure. Fear is not eliminated by discipline, only shaped by it. When structures fail, fear returns in its more immediate form, stripped of the buffering effects of expectation and hierarchy. What remains is direct confrontation with uncertainty. At the same time, these experiences also reinforce the importance of earlier conditioning. Warriors who have repeatedly trained under simulated pressure are better able to function when real pressure exceeds anticipated levels. The body retains patterns even when the mind loses clarity. This embodied continuity becomes a crucial survival factor in chaotic environments. It is also in these moments that leadership is most visibly tested. Commanders are not only responsible for issuing orders, but for maintaining coherence under conditions where coherence is under constant threat. A single decision can stabilize or further destabilize a fragmenting situation. The psychological burden of leadership in such environments is significant, as it requires simultaneous awareness of multiple unstable variables. However, even the most capable leadership cannot fully control outcomes once large-scale fragmentation begins. Chance, timing, and localized conditions play increasingly dominant roles. This reinforces the fundamental uncertainty that underlies all samurai warfare, regardless of period or structure. What distinguishes these moments from ordinary battlefield conditions is the intensity of compression. Time feels accelerated. Decisions must be made with reduced information. Consequences unfold rapidly. Fear, under such pressure, loses its gradual character and becomes immediate and total, affecting perception, movement, and judgment simultaneously. And yet, even within this intensity, there is no uniform collapse of identity. Samurai do not cease to be shaped by their training, philosophy, or social expectations. These frameworks remain present, even if they cannot fully regulate the situation. They influence how individuals interpret their actions during and after the fact, providing meaning to experiences that are otherwise defined by uncertainty. In this sense, moments of collapse and chaos do not exist outside the structure of samurai life. They are part of it. They reveal the limits of discipline, but also its necessity. Without prior training, such moments would produce total paralysis or incoherence. With training, they produce fragmented but still functional responses. Over time, these episodes accumulate into a broader cultural memory. Stories of battles where order dissolved and warriors continued to act under impossible conditions contribute to later interpretations of samurai resilience. But beneath these narratives lies a more grounded reality. Fear never disappears, but it is continuously forced to operate within conditions that test its limits. And it is in this tension between structure and collapse, between training and unpredictability, that the deeper psychological landscape of samurai existence becomes most visible, not as a system that removes fear, but as one that repeatedly forces fear to coexist with action under conditions where certainty is never guaranteed. In the samurai world, death is not only something that happens on the battlefield, it's also something that can be structured, prepared, and even performed within a framework of ritual control. Among the most striking expressions of this reality is seppuku, a practice that later generations often misunderstand as either extreme honor or extreme tragedy, depending on perspective, but within its historical context, it functions as something more specific. A mechanism for transforming uncontrollable fear into controlled meaning at the moment when all other forms of structure have failed. To understand seppuku, it is necessary to separate its symbolic interpretation from its practical role. In later cultural memory, it becomes associated with ideals of unwavering loyalty and absolute commitment to honor. While these associations are not entirely incorrect, they often obscure the more immediate realities of feudal life in which it developed. In a system where reputation determines survival for entire households, and where failure can cascade into political and social collapse, death itself becomes part of the framework of accountability. Seppuku emerges in this environment not as a spontaneous act, but as a culturally regulated response to dishonor, defeat, or irreversible failure of duty. It is embedded within a social logic where the manner of death carries significance equal to, and sometimes greater than, the continuation of life. This does not mean that fear of death disappears. On the contrary, the act derives much of its psychological weight precisely from the fact that fear remains fully present. What distinguishes seppuku from battlefield death is not the absence of fear, but the restructuring of its context. On the battlefield, death arrives unpredictably, shaped by chance, timing, and external force. In ritual death, the moment is defined, contained, and surrounded by procedures that limit uncertainty. This containment does not eliminate fear, but it changes its temporal structure. Fear is no longer diffuse and anticipatory. It becomes concentrated into a specific known interval. Historical accounts suggest that the preparation for such acts was often deliberate and ritualized. The presence of witnesses, the arrangement of space, and the formalization of gestures all contribute to an environment in which personal emotion is placed within a structured sequence. This structure does not remove emotional intensity, it organizes it. Within this framework, the samurai is not acting outside fear. He's acting within a system that assumes fear and attempts to give it form. The psychological challenge is not ignorance of mortality, but direct confrontation with it under conditions where escape is not the central issue. Instead, the focus shifts toward maintaining composure in the presence of an inevitable outcome. The role of witnesses in this process is significant. Seppuku is not a private act. It is a socially observed one, embedded in the mechanisms of accountability that define feudal relationships. The presence of others transforms the act from personal decision into public statement. This reinforces the idea that identity within samurai culture is never entirely individual. It is always relational, defined through perception, as much as internal experience. In this sense, fear operates on multiple levels simultaneously. There is the immediate biological fear of bodily harm, there is the social fear of judgment and legacy, and there is the existential awareness of finality. Seppuku does not remove these layers, it forces them into alignment within a single structured moment. Training and cultural conditioning play a role in shaping how such moments are approached. The same disciplines that govern battlefield behavior control of expression, regulation of response, adherence to ritual form also influence how controlled death is conceptualized. The emphasis is not on emotional absence, but on continuity of behavior under extreme conditions. It is important to note that not all samurai engaged in seppuku, and its use varied across time, region, and political context. It should not be interpreted as a universal or constant practice across the entire history of the warrior class. However, its presence within the cultural and historical framework of samurai society is significant because it reveals how deeply structured the relationship between life, death, and social expectation had become. In some cases, seppuku is associated with the preservation of honor for both individual and household. In others, it functions as a form of punishment or enforced resolution to political failure. In either case, the underlying structure is similar. Death is integrated into the system of accountability rather than existing outside it. This integration has profound implications for how fear is understood. When death is no longer exclusively an external event, but also a socially regulated possibility, fear is no longer confined to moments of external threat. It becomes embedded in the framework of decision-making itself. Every action carries potential implications that extend beyond immediate survival. At the same time, the ritualization of death introduces a paradox. By structuring the moment of greatest uncertainty, it reduces certain dimensions of unpredictability while intensifying others. The timing is known, but the emotional experience remains intense. The sequence is defined, but the internal response is not fully controllable. This tension is central to understanding how fear operates in such contexts. Philosophical influences again intersect with this practice. Buddhist awareness of impermanence provides a conceptual background in which the finality of death is not entirely external to life, but part of its continuous flow. Confucian emphasis on duty and role fulfillment reinforces the idea that individual existence is embedded within broader social structures. Together, these perspectives create a framework in which controlled death can be interpreted not as rupture, but as resolution within a structured system. However, it is important not to overstate the coherence of this interpretation. Historical reality remains complex, and motivations for such acts vary widely. Some are shaped by political pressure, others by personal conviction, and others by institutional expectation. Fear is present in all cases, but its expression and interpretation differ depending on context. What remains consistent is the presence of structure. Even at the point where life is ending, samurai culture seeks to impose order on uncertainty. This does not eliminate fear. It reframes it within a sequence of meaning that extends beyond the individual moment. In this way, seppuku reveals something fundamental about the broader samurai relationship with fear. It is not a rejection of fear, nor a transcendence of it, but an attempt to integrate even the most extreme form of human vulnerability into a system of controlled behavior. Death, in this context, is not outside structure. It is one of the final points where structure still attempts to operate. And it is from this extreme boundary where control and uncertainty intersect at their most intense that the broader psychological architecture of samurai existence becomes most visible, showing that even fear at its highest intensity is not simply endured, but organized, interpreted, and given form within the cultural logic of the warrior world. For much of samurai history, the idea of an enemy is shaped by familiarity. Rival clans, neighboring domains, and known political factions all exist within a shared cultural and military framework. Even when conflict is intense, there is a kind of mutual understanding of rules, expectations, and recognizable patterns of warfare. But there are moments when this familiarity breaks, when the samurai encounter forces that do not fit neatly into established categories of conflict. In these moments, fear takes on a different character because it is no longer grounded in predictable systems. One of the clearest disruptions to this familiarity comes with the arrival of foreign forces in the late medieval and early modern periods. The introduction of Portuguese traders and later Spanish influence followed by military technology such as firearms, alters the structure of warfare in ways that cannot be immediately absorbed into traditional frameworks. These encounters are not just military challenges, they are epistemological shocks. They force a re-evaluation of what combat means when its rules no longer feel stable. Firearms, in particular, present a form of violence that is detached from the embodied skill set that defines much of samurai identity. Swordsmanship, archery, and close combat rely on training that integrates perception, timing, and physical discipline. Firearms disrupt this relationship by reducing the role of bodily mastery in the moment of execution. The result is not only tactical adjustment, but psychological disorientation. Fear in this context is amplified not by proximity, but by unpredictability. Historical accounts of early firearm engagements suggest a mixture of fascination, hesitation, and rapid adaptation. Some samurai respond with attempts to integrate the technology into existing frameworks of warfare. Others initially resist its legitimacy, seeing it as incompatible with established martial values. But regardless of response, the underlying effect is the same: the battlefield becomes less readable. When cause and effect become less visually intuitive, fear becomes more difficult to regulate through training alone. This disruption extends beyond foreign contact. Internal uprisings, peasant rebellions, and religiously motivated conflicts also introduce forms of resistance that do not behave according to conventional samurai expectations. Unlike clan-based warfare, these conflicts may lack formal hierarchy or recognizable command structures. They can appear diffuse, decentralized, and unpredictable in their organization. In such situations, the enemy is no longer simply an opposing warrior class. It can be a shifting collective, difficult to categorize or anticipate. This creates a different type of uncertainty. Samurai trained within structured systems of hierarchy and loyalty must now interpret movements that do not conform to those structures. Fear, in these cases, is intensified by ambiguity. It is not always clear where threat originates or how it will manifest. One of the psychological consequences of encountering such unknown enemies is the breakdown of assumption-based thinking. In familiar warfare, prior knowledge of enemy behavior helps reduce uncertainty. In unfamiliar contexts, that predictive layer is weakened. Decisions must be made with less reliable information, increasing cognitive strain under pressure. At the same time, these encounters force adaptation. Samurai begin to incorporate new tactics, technologies, and strategies into their existing frameworks. This process is not immediate, and it is often uneven across different domains. Some regions adopt firearms rapidly, while others integrate them more cautiously. The result is a period of transitional warfare where old and new forms coexist, sometimes uneasily. Fear in this transitional space is not eliminated by adaptation. Instead, it shifts focus. What was once predictable becomes uncertain again, but in a different way. The enemy is no longer only the known rival domain, but also the unknown potential of technological and social change itself. In this sense, fear becomes more abstract, less tied to immediate physical presence, and more tied to systemic transformation. Religious and philosophical frameworks again play a role in managing this shift. The concept of impermanence becomes particularly relevant when established forms of warfare begin to dissolve. If all systems are transient, then even martial traditions are subject to change. This does not eliminate resistance to change, but it provides a conceptual space in which adaptation can be understood rather than purely resisted. Confucian ideas of order and hierarchy are also challenged in these encounters. When conflict does not fit neatly into established structures of authority, the clarity of role-based behavior becomes harder to maintain. Samurai must navigate situations where traditional expectations of enemy behavior no longer apply cleanly. This increases reliance on situational judgment, which in turn increases the psychological burden of decision-making under uncertainty. It is important to note that these unknown enemies are not always foreign or technological. Even within internal Japanese conflicts, there are moments when established categories break down. Bandit groups, religious sects, and localized resistance movements sometimes operate outside the expected logic of feudal warfare. These groups may not seek control in the same way as traditional domains, making their behavior harder to predict and contain. In all these cases, the central issue is not simply military effectiveness, but interpretive instability. When the enemy cannot be easily categorized, fear becomes less about immediate threat and more about the inability to anticipate consequences. The mind is forced to operate without the usual scaffolding of expectation. Despite this, samurai responses continue to reflect the underlying structure of their training. Even when confronted with unfamiliar forms of warfare, they rely on discipline, repetition, and adaptation. The body retains learned responses even when the environment changes. This continuity provides a stabilizing factor in situations where conceptual understanding is insufficient. Over time, repeated exposure to unfamiliar forms of conflict contributes to a broader cultural shift. The idea of what constitutes a proper enemy becomes more flexible. Warfare is no longer defined solely by recognizable opponents, but by the conditions under which conflict occurs. This expansion of definition allows for continued functionality, but it also reinforces the sense that stability is never guaranteed. Fear, in these contexts, becomes deeply tied to uncertainty rather than direct confrontation. It is not only the presence of danger that matters, but the inability to fully define it. This type of fear is more diffuse, less focused, and harder to resolve through action alone. And yet, even here, the samurai response is not collapse, it is adjustment. New tactics are learned, new tools are adopted, and new frameworks of understanding are constructed. The warrior identity does not remain static in the face of unknown enemies. It evolves, sometimes slowly, sometimes abruptly, but always under pressure. What remains consistent is not the form of the enemy, but the internal structure of response. Fear continues to exist, but it is processed through systems of training, philosophy, and social expectation that have been refined over centuries of earlier instability. Even when the enemy becomes unfamiliar, the internal architecture of the samurai world continues to provide a way of acting within uncertainty. And it is this ongoing tension between familiarity and disruption, between known codes of warfare and unknown forms of conflict, that continues to shape the deeper psychological landscape of the samurai experience, revealing once again that fear is not eliminated by experience, but constantly redefined by it. When the Tokugawa shogunate finally unifies much of Japan under centralized rule, the rhythm of samurai life begins to shift in a way that is almost imperceptible at first, yet profound in its long-term consequences. The constant background of large-scale warfare, which had defined generations of warrior existence, gradually recedes, castles remain, swords remain, and hierarchy remains. But the conditions that once gave these structures their immediate urgency begin to fade. What replaces them is not simplicity, but a different kind of complexity, one where violence is no longer constant, but remembered, regulated, and carefully contained. This period of relative peace does not eliminate the samurai class. Instead, it transforms its function. Warriors become administrators, bureaucrats, and local enforcers of a system that is now more concerned with stability than expansion. The battlefield, once the defining stage of samurai identity, becomes increasingly distant from daily life. For many samurai born into the Edo period, the experience of real combat becomes something inherited through stories rather than directly lived. This shift creates a psychological divergence within the warrior identity. The earlier generations were shaped by direct exposure to violence, where fear was constantly tested against immediate danger. The new generations inherit a structure built on those experiences, but without the same continuous pressure that originally formed it. As a result, fear itself begins to change its position within samurai life. It becomes less about survival in battle and more about social, political, and existential relevance within a peaceful system. In the absence of war, discipline does not disappear. Instead, it becomes more formalized, more symbolic, and in some ways more rigid. Ritual replaces urgency, etiquette replaces improvisation. The sword, once a tool of immediate necessity, becomes increasingly a marker of identity and status. It is still carried, still maintained, still respected, but its function shifts from practical survival instrument to emblem of historical authority. Yet even in peace, the memory of instability remains deeply embedded in samurai consciousness. The structures of Edo society are designed by people who understand what prolonged chaos looks like. This historical memory shapes governance, social hierarchy, and even daily behavior. Fear, therefore, does not vanish. It is displaced into new forms of awareness, concern for reputation, adherence to strict codes of conduct, and sensitivity to political stability within the rigid structure of the shogunate. The Tokugawa system itself reinforces this transformation. By strictly regulating domains, limiting military engagement, and controlling mobility, it reduces the opportunities for large-scale conflict. But it also increases the importance of symbolic order. A samurai's behavior becomes more visible, more scrutinized, and more bound by expectation. In this environment, fear is no longer primarily about physical danger. It is about social consequence within an extremely structured hierarchy. This shift produces a subtle but significant internal tension. The samurai identity is still grounded in ideals formed during centuries of warfare, but its practical environment no longer matches those conditions. As a result, the meaning of fear becomes more abstract. It is less about imminent death and more about the preservation of status, dignity, and continuity within a system that no longer requires constant martial action. Education becomes increasingly important during this period. Many samurai are trained not only in martial skills but also in literature, administration, and philosophy. Confucian thought becomes especially influential, reinforcing ideas of order, duty, and moral governance. In this framework, fear is further internalized. It is no longer simply a response to external threat, but also a mechanism for maintaining proper behavior within a structured society. At the same time, the lack of real combat experience begins to create a gap between idealized warrior identity and lived reality. Stories of past battles, legendary figures, and heroic conduct become more central to samurai self-understanding than direct experience. The past is no longer just memory, it becomes a model for behavior that is increasingly symbolic. This is where the mythology of the fearless samurai begins to solidify more clearly. Without continuous exposure to real battlefield conditions, later generations interpret earlier records through a lens shaped by idealization. Acts of discipline, restraint, and controlled behavior are increasingly read as evidence of emotional absence rather than emotional management. Fear, which was once actively negotiated in real time, becomes retrospectively erased in cultural memory. Yet beneath this cultural transformation, the structural foundations remain unchanged. The possibility of violence is still embedded within the system, even if it is rarely realized. Domains are still governed with an awareness of potential conflict. Samurai retain their status as a military class, even when their daily function shifts away from warfare. This latent structure ensures that fear, though less frequently activated, is never fully removed from the system. One of the most significant psychological effects of prolonged peace is the internalization of discipline as identity rather than necessity. What was once a response to external instability becomes a marker of internal character. Behaviour that was originally shaped by survival conditions becomes codified as moral expectation. In this process, the distinction between practical adaptation and ethical ideal becomes increasingly blurred. The sword, for example, continues to carry symbolic weight, but its meaning evolves further. It becomes a reminder of a past in which fear and discipline were inseparable from daily existence. In Edo society, carrying a sword is no longer primarily about immediate combat readiness. It is about maintaining connection to a historical identity defined by conflict. However, this symbolic function also introduces a new kind of tension. When the conditions that produce certain behaviours disappear, those behaviours must find new justification. The samurai class increasingly defines itself through ideals of conduct rather than through direct martial necessity. Loyalty, discipline, and restraint become central, not because they are always required by circumstance, but because they define continuity with the past. Fear, in this context, becomes even more internalized. It is no longer primarily triggered by external threat, but by deviation from expected behaviour. Social and moral frameworks become the primary systems through which fear is organised. The fear of dishonour, of loss of status, or of failure to embody expected ideals becomes more prominent than fear of physical danger. At the same time, the absence of widespread conflict allows for reflection and codification. Writers, scholars, and officials begin to articulate more explicitly what it means to be a samurai. These articulations often emphasise composure, self-control, and readiness, reinforcing the image of emotional stability under pressure, but they are often written in a context far removed from the original conditions that produced those behaviours. This distance between experience and interpretation is crucial. It is in this gap that later idealizations of samurai fearlessness take shape. What was once a practical adaptation to constant danger becomes reinterpreted as a timeless virtue. The emotional labour of managing fear under extreme conditions is gradually transformed into a narrative of inherent calmness. Yet even in this transformed landscape, the underlying psychological structure remains present. The samurai identity continues to carry within it the memory of instability, even when that instability is no longer constantly experienced. Fear, therefore, is not eliminated by peace. It is reorganised, redirected, and embedded into new forms of social and moral awareness. And it is within this tension between lived peace and remembered violence that the samurai identity continues to evolve, shaped as much by what is absent as by what remains, carrying forward the deeper historical imprint of a world where fear was once not an exception, but a constant condition of existence. By the time later generations look back on the samurai, what they see is no longer the full weight of lived experience, but a carefully filtered image shaped by distance, storytelling, and cultural reinterpretation. The warrior who once lived in constant negotiation with uncertainty gradually becomes a symbol of certainty itself. Fear, which was once a continuous presence requiring constant management, begins to disappear from the narrative, not because it was absent in reality, but because it is less visible in the idealized memory that survives. This transformation is not accidental. It is the result of a long process in which lived behaviour is recorded, retold, and reshaped across changing historical contexts. In the peaceful stability of the Edo period and beyond, samurai conduct is increasingly interpreted through moral and philosophical frameworks that emphasize discipline, loyalty, and composure. Over time, these interpretations begin to overshadow the unstable conditions that originally produced such behaviours. What emerges is a simplified image of the samurai as a figure who does not hesitate, does not waver, and does not experience fear in the way ordinary individuals do. Yet when examined against earlier sections of their history, this image reveals its limits. Behaviours associated with fearlessness are not the absence of fear, but the result of long training in managing fear under conditions of extreme uncertainty. Historical records, when read closely, rarely support the idea of emotional absence. Instead, they point towards structured responses to danger. Warriors retreat, hesitate, reassess, and adapt. They act within fear, not outside it. The appearance of calm is often the result of discipline, repetition, and social expectation rather than emotional void. However, as Japan enters long periods of peace, particularly under Tokugawa rule, the lived experience of warfare diminishes dramatically for many members of the samurai class. This shift creates a generational gap. Those who have experienced battle firsthand carry memories shaped by instability and immediate risk. Those born into peace inherit systems of discipline without the same direct exposure to the conditions that produced them. It is within this gap that myth begins to take hold more firmly. Stories of earlier warriors are passed down in forms that emphasize clarity, decisiveness, and unwavering loyalty. The complexity of decision-making under pressure is gradually simplified into examples of moral certainty. Fear, which once had to be actively managed in real time, becomes something that is either ignored or implicitly denied in cultural retellings. Literature, theatre, and later historical writing contribute to this process. Dramatic narratives often prioritise symbolic clarity over psychological nuance. A warrior who hesitates internally but acts under pressure becomes, in retelling, a figure who never hesitates at all. Over time, repetition of these narratives solidifies an image that feels historically consistent, even when it is only partially aligned with lived reality. At the same time, philosophical interpretations reinforce this simplification. Concepts drawn from Confucian ethics, Buddhist thought, and later moral systems are used to frame samurai behavior as expressions of ideal conduct. Impermanence becomes equated with acceptance, duty becomes equated with certainty, discipline becomes equated with emotional control so complete that fear appears to vanish altogether. But beneath these interpretations, the structural conditions that shaped earlier samurai life remain important. Fearlessness, when understood historically, is not the absence of emotional response. It is the product of systems designed to regulate, channel, and stabilize that response under pressure. Training, repetition, hierarchy, and cultural expectation all work together to create behavior that appears composed even when internal experience is complex. One of the most significant distortions in later myth-making is the tendency to collapse this complexity into a single trait. The samurai becomes not someone who manages fear, but someone who does not have it. This shift is subtle but profound. It transforms a learned and context-dependent behavior into an essential and timeless characteristic. Yet even within the mythologized tradition, traces of the underlying reality remain. Stories of hesitation, internal conflict, and difficult choices still appear, though often framed as moral tests rather than psychological processes. The presence of these elements suggests that even idealized narratives cannot fully erase the tension that defines warrior experience. Another important factor in the construction of myth is the changing function of the samurai class itself. As their role transitions from active military engagement to administrative and symbolic authority, their identity becomes increasingly tied to representation rather than direct action. In this context, the preservation of an idealized image serves a cultural purpose. It maintains continuity with a past that is no longer lived but remains socially significant. This process is not unique to samurai culture. Many societies reinterpret their martial pasts in ways that emphasize clarity, courage, and emotional stability. However, in the case of the samurai, the long period of relative peace intensifies this transformation. Without ongoing large-scale warfare to continually test and reshape the image, interpretation gradually replaces experience as the primary source of understanding. Fear, therefore, becomes one of the most heavily reinterpreted elements of samurai history. In lived reality, it is constant, adaptive, and structurally embedded in decision-making. In myth, it is often minimized or removed entirely. What remains is a figure who appears to act without hesitation, even though historical conditions suggest that hesitation, calculation, and emotional regulation were deeply embedded in every action. This tension between myth and reality does not invalidate the cultural image of the samurai. Instead, it reveals the process by which cultural memory simplifies complexity in order to create coherent identity. The fearless warrior is not simply a false invention, it is a selective reconstruction built upon real behaviors, abstracted from their original context. At the core of this reconstruction is a misunderstanding of what discipline actually entails. Discipline is often mistaken for emotional absence, when in fact it is a system for operating within emotion, without being overwhelmed by it. The samurai who appears calm in historical or literary accounts is not necessarily without fear, but rather operating within a framework that organizes fear into functional response. As this framework becomes less visible in later periods, the distinction between management and absence becomes harder to perceive. What was once a learned skill is gradually interpreted as inherent nature. This is the foundation of the myth of fearlessness, not a fabrication, but a simplification that removes the visible labor of psychological control. Even modern interpretations continue to grapple with this tension. The samurai is often invoked as a symbol of composure under pressure, but the historical record consistently points toward a more complex reality. Fear is not absent in their world. It is structured, disciplined, and continuously negotiated within systems of loyalty, duty, and survival. And it is precisely this negotiation, rather than its erasure, that defines the deeper historical truth behind the image. The samurai do not stand outside fear, they exist within it, shaped by it, and continually adapting to it in ways that later myth would simplify but never fully erase. Even after the age of the samurai has long ended as a lived military reality, its psychological imprint does not simply vanish. It shifts form, moving from battlefield necessity into cultural memory, from structured violence into symbolic language. What remains is not the constant presence of swords or sieges, but the persistence of a mindset shaped by centuries of instability, discipline, and the continuous management of fear under pressure. In modern Japan, the samurai no longer exist as a governing warrior class, yet their influence continues to appear in unexpected places. It is visible in education systems that emphasize discipline and repetition, in workplace expectations that value endurance and controlled behavior, and in cultural narratives that highlight restraint over outward expression. These are not direct continuations of feudal warfare, but echoes of a long historical process in which emotional regulation was essential for survival. The transformation of samurai identity into cultural memory is not a simple act of preservation. It is a gradual filtering of experience through changing social needs. As Japan modernizes, industrializes, and integrates into global systems, The direct conditions that once produced samurai behaviour disappear, but the language used to describe that behaviour remains, and it continues to shape how discipline and composure are understood. One of the most persistent echoes of this legacy is the association between calmness and strength. In samurai narratives, composure under pressure is often treated as evidence of exceptional character. In modern interpretations, this idea is frequently detached from its historical context and applied more broadly as a cultural ideal. Yet within the original environment, composure was not an abstract virtue. It was a practical requirement for functioning in situations where hesitation could lead to immediate consequences. The modern reinterpretation of this behaviour often overlooks the role of fear in its formation. What appears as calmness from the outside was historically the result of repeated exposure to instability, structured training, and cultural reinforcement. Fear was not absent, it was continuously managed, redirected, and integrated into action. The visible result of that process is what later generations come to interpret as emotional control. This reinterpretation becomes even more pronounced in popular culture. Films, literature, and global media often present samurai figures as almost detached from ordinary emotional experience. They are depicted as individuals who act with certainty even in moments of extreme danger. While these portrayals are powerful and influential, they often simplify the underlying psychological reality in order to create clear symbolic meaning. Behind this simplification lies a more complex historical truth. The samurai world was not one of emotional absence, but of emotional structure. Fear was a constant companion, shaped by shifting political landscapes, social obligations, and the unpredictable nature of warfare. What distinguished samurai behaviour was not the elimination of fear, but the ability to operate within it under sustained pressure. In this sense, modern echoes of samurai culture are less about literal continuity and more about inherited patterns of interpretation. The idea of endurance, discipline, and controlled response continues to resonate, because it offers a way of understanding how individuals can function under stress. But the original conditions that produce these patterns are often absent from contemporary representations. At a deeper level, the samurai legacy also reflects a broader human question. How do people act when uncertainty is constant and outcomes cannot be guaranteed? Across different periods of history, societies develop different answers to this question. In the samurai world, the answer is structured through hierarchy, training, philosophy, and ritual. Fear is acknowledged as unavoidable, but it is organized into systems that allow action to continue despite it. This structural approach to fear does not disappear with the end of the samurai era. Instead, it is absorbed into cultural memory and reinterpreted in ways that fit new social contexts. The language of loyalty, discipline, and composure becomes detached from its original environment and applied more broadly as cultural values, even when the conditions that once gave them meaning have changed. Yet even in modern reinterpretations, traces of the original tension remain visible. The fascination with samurai culture often centers not only on their skill or status, but on their perceived relationship with mortality. The idea of individuals who can face extreme danger without visible hesitation continues to hold symbolic power. This fascination persists precisely because it touches on a fundamental human concern, the management of fear in uncertain conditions. However, when viewed through a historical lens, it becomes clear that this fascination often simplifies what was actually a highly complex psychological and social system. The samurai did not transcend fear. They operated within it, shaped by it, and constrained by it in ways that were deeply embedded in their environment. Their responses were not static traits, but adaptive behaviours developed over centuries of changing conditions. The modern legacy of the samurai, therefore, is not a direct continuation of their historical reality, but a layered reconstruction. It combines fragments of lived experience, philosophical interpretation, and cultural idealization into a single image that is both compelling and incomplete. Within that image, fear is often minimized, but in the historical reality, it was always present, always managed, and always structurally significant. As this long historical arc comes into focus, what emerges is not a story of individuals who stood beyond fear, but a story of a society that continuously developed ways to live within it. From the earliest provincial conflicts to the structured peace of the Edo period, and finally into modern reinterpretation, the samurai experience reveals a consistent pattern. Fear does not disappear, it changes form, it shifts meaning, and it is reorganized through culture, training, and memory. In the end, the echo that remains is not silence in the face of danger, but adaptation within it. The samurai legacy persists not because it represents the absence of fear, but because it demonstrates a long and intricate history of learning how to act despite its presence. And it is this tension between vulnerability and control, instability and discipline that continues to shape how the samurai are remembered, long after the world that created them has faded. When the age of the samurai finally recedes into history, it does not end with a single moment of disappearance. There is no clear boundary where the warrior world simply stops and modern life begins. Instead, there is a long after-image, a gradual fading in which structures remain while their original purpose slowly dissolves. Castles still stand in altered forms. Names of clans survive in records and memory. Even the language used to describe discipline, loyalty, and restraint continues to circulate long after the conditions that created them have changed. What is most striking about this afterimage is not what is present, but what is absent and still felt. The constant background pressure of uncertainty that once defined samurai existence is no longer a daily reality, yet its psychological imprint does not vanish immediately. It lingers in cultural memory as a kind of inherited sensitivity to order, hierarchy, and controlled behaviour. Fear, once an immediate and necessary companion in every decision, becomes something remembered rather than continuously experienced. In earlier periods, fear had structure because the world demanded it. It was distributed across many layers of life battle, loyalty, reputation, survival, and social consequence. In the absence of those conditions, the structure does not disappear completely, it transforms into interpretation. Later generations inherit not the direct experience of fear under constant threat, but the language used to describe how that fear was managed. This is where the image of the fearless samurai becomes most powerful, and also most misleading. It emerges not from lived experience, but from the compression of experience into symbols. Over time, complex behaviours shaped by training and necessity are simplified into traits. What was once learned discipline becomes perceived nature. What was once careful emotional regulation becomes interpreted as emotional absence. Yet beneath this simplification, the original reality remains intact in its structure, even if it is no longer visible in its original form. The samurai were not defined by the absence of fear, but by the continuous need to operate within it, and their world required them to make decisions under conditions where outcomes were uncertain, consequences were severe, and stability could not be assumed. In such an environment, fear is not an exception. It is the baseline condition of awareness. What training, philosophy, and social structure accomplished was not the removal of this condition, but its organisation. Fear was shaped into forms that allowed action to continue. It was redirected through hierarchy, ritual, repetition, and expectation. It was given meaning through ideas of duty, impermanence, and responsibility, and in this transformation, fear became less visible, even while remaining fully present. In the centuries that followed the end of large-scale samurai warfare, this invisible structure began to shift into cultural memory. Without the constant pressure of battle, later generations encountered samurai identity primarily through stories, records, and symbolic representations. These sources naturally emphasize clarity over ambiguity, decisiveness over hesitation, and composure over internal conflict. The psychological labour behind these qualities becomes less visible with time. As a result, the samurai are increasingly remembered not as individuals navigating fear, but as figures who stand outside it. This interpretation is reinforced by artistic tradition, literature, and modern media, all of which tend to highlight the most symbolically coherent aspects of their behaviour. The complexity of lived experience is gradually condensed into archetype. But archetypes always carry traces of what they simplify. The idea of fearlessness, when examined closely, still contains the outline of fear itself. It exists because fear once mattered deeply enough to require structure, discipline, and meaning. Without that underlying reality, the concept would have no weight. The very existence of the ideal points back toward the condition it was designed to manage. In this sense, the samurai legacy is not a story of transcendence above fear, but of sustained coexistence with it. Across centuries of shifting political systems, from provincial conflict to centralized peace, from battlefield necessity to symbolic memory, the fundamental challenge remains consistent: how to act when certainty is unavailable. Different periods offer different answers. In early warfare, the answer is survival through adaptation. In structured feudal systems, it is loyalty within hierarchy. In philosophical interpretation, it is acceptance of impermanence. In ritual practice, it is the organization of even death into meaningful form. But in every case, fear remains part of the equation, even when it is not always visible. Modern reflections on samurai culture often return to this tension without fully resolving it. There is a reason these figures continue to attract attention across cultures and eras. They represent not a state of emotional absence, but a highly developed system for functioning under conditions where emotional certainty cannot be guaranteed. That system is both historical and psychological, both specific and universal. The silence that surrounds the end of the samurai era is therefore not an absence of meaning, but a shift in where meaning resides. What was once expressed through immediate action becomes embedded in memory and interpretation. The blade is no longer drawn in daily life, but its symbolism continues to shape how discipline, restraint, and courage are imagined. Even the idea of calmness under pressure, so often associated with samurai imagery, takes on a different tone when viewed from this broader perspective. Calmness is not the absence of internal disturbance, but the visible outcome of internal organisation. It is the surface expression of systems built over time to manage instability. Without understanding that underlying structure, the surface can easily be misread. And so, what remains after the blade is no longer in use is not simplicity, but layered inheritance. Fear, discipline, loyalty, and impermanence continue to interact, even when their original context has faded. The samurai world becomes less a historical period and more a framework through which later generations interpret questions of action under uncertainty. In the end, the most enduring aspect of this legacy is not the image of warriors who do not feel fear, but the more difficult truth that they did, and yet still acted, not beyond fear, but within it, not without uncertainty, but through it, not outside the conditions of human vulnerability, but deeply embedded in them. And when the noise of battle finally fades into history, what remains is not silence as emptiness, but silence as continuation, the long echo of a world that once demanded that fear be not eliminated, but lived with, structured, and carried forward in every decision that mattered. Even after every structure collapses into memory, after every battlefield has long since gone silent and every castle has been reduced to outline and restoration, there is still one element of the samurai world that does not fully disappear. It is not the sword, nor the armour, nor the political system that once sustained them. It is something far less visible, but far more persistent: the human relationship with uncertainty. The samurai experience, when stripped of its cultural ornament and later myth, ultimately returns to a simple but difficult truth. Fear is not an anomaly in human life. It is part of its architecture. What changes across time is not whether fear exists, but how societies organise it, interpret it, and allow it to influence action. In the world that produced samurai culture, uncertainty was not occasional. It was structural. Political alliances shifted, land ownership was unstable, and violence could emerge without long warning. Under those conditions, fear was not a reaction reserved for rare moments. It was an ambient condition that shaped perception continuously. The mind did not encounter fear as interruption, it encountered it as background. What makes the samurai case so enduring in cultural memory is not that they escaped this condition, but that they developed an elaborate set of responses to remain functional within it. Training, ritual, philosophy, hierarchy, and symbolism all contributed to a shared attempt to make action possible in a world that could not be made fully predictable. Yet even this system had limits. No amount of discipline could remove uncertainty from warfare. No philosophical framework could guarantee control over outcomes. No ritual could fully stabilize the moment when life and death separated without warning. What these systems achieved instead was something more subtle. They reduced the paralysis that uncertainty can produce, allowing action to continue even when clarity was incomplete. In modern interpretation, however, this process is often simplified. The visible result, composure under pressure, is separated from the invisible effort required to produce it. Fear disappears from the narrative not because it was absent, but because it was managed so effectively that its management itself becomes invisible in retrospect. What remains is the image of calm, detached from the conditions that made calm necessary in the first place. This is where historical memory and lived reality begin to diverge most sharply. The samurai who stands in cultural imagination is often a figure of certainty, but the samurai who existed in history was defined by repeated encounters with uncertainty. The difference between these two images is not simply accuracy versus inaccuracy. It is compression. Complexity is reduced into form that can be carried forward more easily across generations. But even within this compression, something important survives. The idea that human beings can act meaningfully even when fear is present does not disappear. If anything, it becomes more prominent. The samurai legacy, in its most enduring form, is not about the absence of emotional struggle, but about the possibility of structure within it. This has implications that extend far beyond the historical context of feudal Japan. Every society, in different ways, develops systems for managing uncertainty. Some rely on institutional stability, others rely on cultural norms. Some emphasize individual resilience, while others emphasize collective coordination. The samurai world represents one particular historical answer to a universal problem: how to function when the future cannot be guaranteed. In that sense, the question of why samurai were remembered as fearless reveals something deeper than historical curiosity. It reveals a human tendency to reinterpret survival strategies as inherent traits. When a system successfully produces consistent behaviour under stress, later observers often describe that behaviour as natural rather than constructed. Discipline becomes character, training becomes essence, adaptation becomes identity. Yet beneath that reinterpretation, the original condition remains unchanged. Fear continues to exist wherever outcomes matter, and control is incomplete. The difference lies in whether that fear leads to paralysis or action, fragmentation or structure. The samurai system, like many others across history, represents a sustained attempt to influence that outcome. Even in the absence of warfare, the psychological patterns developed under those conditions do not vanish immediately. They shift into other domains of life work: responsibility, hierarchy, and personal discipline. Modern societies may no longer require swords, but they continue to navigate environments where uncertainty exists in different forms: economic, social, and personal. The underlying challenge remains recognizable. What changes most dramatically over time is visibility. In periods of constant conflict, fear is easier to recognize because its triggers are immediate and physical. In more stable systems, fear becomes diffuse. It attaches itself to expectations as decisions run long-term consequences rather than direct threats. It becomes quieter, but not weaker. The samurai experience, when viewed through this lens, becomes less an isolated historical phenomenon and more a concentrated expression of a broader human condition. It shows what happens when uncertainty is intense, sustained, and unavoidable. It shows how behaviour adapts when avoidance is not an option, and it shows how meaning is constructed around that adaptation to make it socially and psychologically sustainable. In the end, the most important lesson embedded in this long historical arc is not about courage as absence of fear, but courage as coexistence with it. Not a state in which fear disappears, but one in which fear is organised well enough that it does not prevent action. That distinction is subtle, but it changes everything about how the past is understood. When the image of the samurai is reduced to fearlessness, something essential is lost: the struggle, the adaptation, constant negotiation between instinct and obligation, and the continuous effort to act within uncertainty all disappear behind a simplified ideal. But when that image is restored to its full complexity, a different picture emerges, one that is less about perfection and more about persistence. A world where fear was never absent, only structured. A life where uncertainty was never solved, only navigated. And a legacy that continues not because it escaped human vulnerability, but because it reveals how deeply human that vulnerability has always been. In that quiet realization, long after the battles have ended and the stories have been retold countless times, the samurai no longer stand as figures beyond fear. They stand, instead, as a reminder that fear has always been part of the conditions under which human beings learn to act at all.